Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's roundtable discussion, in which we'll be thinking about BIPOC issues as they relate to publishing and media. My name is Louise Bernard. My preferred pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a senior vice president at the Obama Foundation and the founding director of the Obama Presidential Center Museum. We're building the center on the south side of Chicago in historic Jackson Park, which is the original homeland and traditional territory of the Kickapoo, Peoria, Potawatomi, Miami, and Sioux people. As many of you may know, today one of the largest urban American Indian communities in the United States resides in Chicago. I'll note that I was a speaker on the 2020 panel, which was focused on museums. A little bit about the context of this conference. This month marks the one-year anniversary following the murder of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020, of companies and institutions making public commitments to the work of anti-racism. At the BIPOC Directors Collective, we feel it's important for leadership to use their voice and their presence through platforms such as this one to continue the conversation. We've asked directors from across the creative industries, today from media and publishing, to join in the spirit of knowledge sharing and community building as we recognize and envision the hard work still to be done. Leaders within creative industries help us to envision the world anew through storytelling across disciplines. They really elevate voices that may not otherwise be heard, and they help us to make the necessary connections between complicated histories, the power of representation, and the idea of imagination as it uplifts and serves the common good. For viewers, if you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A box and we'll try to answer them if we have time. And I'm going to turn to the panelists and ask them to begin with brief introductions. They'll share their name, their preferred pronouns, their title and roles, and also land acknowledgement. And so we'll go alphabetically by first name, beginning with Amber. Thank you.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for having me. Great to see you here with us today. My name is Amber Payne, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'm the co-editor-in-chief of The Emancipator, which is a project between the Boston Globe and Boston University that we will reimagine the first abolitionist newspaper in the United States. And it's a partnership with the BU's Center for Anti-Racist Research. Looking forward to sharing more about that with you all. And I am on the land of the Wabanaki.
Thank you, Amber. And we'll turn to Bina.
Hi, everyone. I'm Bina Venkatraman, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the editorial page editor of the Boston Globe, and I'm currently on Pawtucket land. I am also the co-founder with Ibram X. Kendi of The Emancipator and a very excited colleague of Amber's. I'll just say one other sentence just to give you a sense. Even though I'm a journalist, my career has sort of spanned different sectors and fields. I worked in government in the Obama White House on climate change. I've worked in academia, trying to wed the worlds of science and policy. So I've had a sort of unusual path to being a leader in journalism.
Thank you, and over to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nu Gote. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am the co-founder of Deem Journal, which is a design journal that examines design at the intersection of social impact, art, and community. And really what we're trying to do is democratize the world of design and make a much more inclusive design space. In relation to that, I also have a research and strategy and design studio called Room for Magic that instigates equitable exchange between communities and entities. And I also moonlight as a professor every so often. I am currently based in Los Angeles, which is the land of the Quiche, the Tongva, and the Chumash. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally to Vanessa.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you and eager to hear this conversation myself. My name is Vanessa Mobley. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am a vice president and executive editor at Little Brown and Company, where I edit nonfiction books. I'm proud to be the editor and publisher of Clint Smith's book, How the Word is Passed, which was just published a few weeks ago. I also work with other prominent journalists like Ronan Farrow, who wrote Catch and Kill. I'm speaking to you from my hometown, Miami, where I'm visiting my parents, and that is Seminole, Dino, and Tequesta land.
Thanks so much for those introductions. I'm eager now to dive into conversation. We'll begin with a kind of high-level conversation around what it means to become a BIPOC director or to be in a position of leadership, really sharing, especially with people who are beginning their career journeys, to understand how you got to be where you are and what that means to you. We'll move to some other questions around accountability, policy change and progress. In other words, what is working, what's not working in this current moment. If there's time, there are other topics we might touch upon, the idea of rebuilding and re-envisioning cultural industry spaces, really thinking about how we dismantle, as opposed to uphold, white supremacy, the kind of glaring spectre of tokenism, and again, how we understand that issue in the present moment. There's lots of conversation around the concept of decolonization, and that's something we might also tap into, very specifically a focus of museums, for example, but it may be something that also touches your work, especially some of the subject matter that you work around within your spaces. And then obviously the issue of building community and really thinking about BIPOC joy. There's much thinking to be done around the complications and the difficulties of the spaces in which we work, but we also want to lean into the idea of excellence and certainly that sense of exuberance or uplift. But let's begin with the first question. How did you become a BIPOC director? And we say this in terms of the fact that across industries, BIPOC representation at leadership levels remains persistently, we might say stubbornly low. Statistically speaking, the people sitting here are actually in a very small percentage of those in leadership positions. So what does it take to get to and keep this seat at the table, so to speak? And how, as a BIPOC person, have you had to navigate this path? So whoever would like to kick off the conversation, really thinking about how you got to be where you are, what it means to have a seat at the table, and how you have navigated that particular route. Anyone willing to jump in?
I'm happy. Oh, go ahead, Nu.
I think we're all being so polite. I don't want to.
You go first.
That's what I was going to add. I think we're all being so polite, but I guess I can kick it off. I think for me, my journey is interesting because I actually started off in the world of marketing and brand, in which in my earlier career served me well and was self-fulfilling. But I found that I was being navigated into a narrow path that was being projected onto me. I was always the cool Black guy in the room, and it was easy for me to be the cool Black guy in the room. But then I realized that, oh, there's other rooms that I'm not even asked to be in. I wonder what's happening in those other rooms. And especially when I made my transition, it's not even a transition, but when I went to grad school to study research and strategy and design thinking, one of the things I realized, like, there are so many impactful conversations that are being had that were not in the room. And so then really where my head has always been was, okay, well, how do I get into those rooms? What are those rooms? What are those spaces? And in order for me to actually become a BIPOC director, I realized, like, oh, I have to create those rooms. Those rooms have to be the ones that I create, that I actually invite other people who aren't invited into other rooms into. And then my goal really is, how do you start to create value within those rooms? I think earlier on in your career, there is a level of investment that you have to have within the system to learn the structure. But I think one of my goals has always been, okay, well, now how do I actually start to build with the people within my community and actually start to give opportunities with people within my community and leverage that as a means to be able to start affecting change. So my journey wasn't as linear, because if I would have stayed on that journey, I would have been the brand director at XYZ consumer brand, but really taking a leap and moving into the world of strategy and actually starting my own publication and my own studio has allowed me to become a BIPOC director, because I would have become one, but not the one that I felt that would have been able to add as much value to the communities and the topics that I'm interested in.
Thank you so much, New. It's really helpful, and especially I think for younger people, again, beginning their career journeys, to kind of hear that example of imagining that there are other spaces that you can step into and actually taking that initiative of being curious to know what else is happening outside of the room you happen to be in at any given moment. But Bina, I think you were willing to also jump in.
Yeah, and I related to much of that. I have felt at various points in my career that the path just looked like it was narrowing, and it might be something in my psychology, but when the path narrows, I start to say, like, what else is going on? Where is this landscape? How does this landscape really look? And, you know, this goes in the category of things that are clear in hindsight, but we're not at all clear on the actual path. So just say that by virtue of saying, depending on where you are in your career, the fact that you're doing something or that you have some sort of theme emerging in how you pattern your career, or how you find a way to have influence or find a way to advance and learn might not always be apparent right in that moment. And so I grew up as I think a lot of BIPOC folks as an outsider. I grew up in a town outside of Cleveland, Ohio, northeastern Ohio, where, as one of the very, very few people of color in my high school, in my town of 20,000 people, very few immigrants, kids of immigrants like me as well. And of course, that had its challenges, but it has sort of become a superpower in other ways. And certainly in my career, I think I can attribute having outsider status to a lot of the steps I've been able to take. So that's also required a bit of being destabilized and a bit of risk taking, and being willing to leave that path, being willing to leave that narrow path. And one very concrete example of that is, I was at the Boston Globe in a previous chapter more than a decade ago. And now actually going on 13 years ago or so, I started off on the Metro desk, listening to the police scanner, reporting on crashes. I had a gig on the science desk, and then I had a brief stint on the editorial board. In each of those positions, I really didn't feel like I belonged in that newsroom. Of course, the newsroom has changed a lot. The culture of the newsroom has changed a lot. It's done a lot around diversity and inclusion, among many other things that have made that possible. But I also was on the low end of the totem pole at a time when the whole business model was imploding and there weren't clear paths forward. And the New York Times owned the Boston Globe at the time. So they were threatening to shut down and shutter the paper altogether. There were massive rounds of buyouts and layoffs happening all the time. And so I really didn't feel like I had a path there. And no one was kind of like handing me like, here's the next job and here's a permanent, like stable job in this newsroom. I was kind of bouncing around. And so I did leave because I found an opportunity in policy, first at MIT, working sort of outside the Obama administration, trying to influence it with good science. But my career came full circle back to the Globe years later. And I wasn't the typical mold of, I didn't fit the typical mold of an editorial page editor, which would typically be someone who had worked 25 years in the newsroom doing every job, Metro job, maybe even running the newsroom, and then eventually coming to the editorial page and to running the editorial board and opinion section, sort of at the end of their career as a sort of pre-retirement job. Once you have you're sort of the sage wisdom of those years and that experience. And I think the reason I was able to be seen as a candidate for that job, despite being unusually qualified, was because I'd left and gone and worked in academia, gone and worked in government at the White House, done things in other sectors and other spheres that then informed my ability to, say, deliberate on policy positions as an editorial board, or help us endorse political candidates, or even having management experience, which you don't typically get in the newsroom until you elevate to that point of editor. So it takes getting that experience and being elevated. So one could look at those as unique challenges of being BIPOC, or, unique challenges that a whole number of people face in newsrooms and other kinds of organizations. But in my case, it was sort of taking that passport of being the outsider. So when I went into academia, I was someone who knew about media. When I went into government, I was someone who knew about science because I'd been in academia and I knew about media. And when I came back into journalism, I was someone who knew about government from the sort of belly of the beast and who knew about science from a different perspective. So I think it's been a lesson in taking interesting exits off the highway, even if they seem high risk, because then you can use those kind of experiences to inform coming back with more influence, coming back with the ability to bring perspective that comes from the outside. And then what I really value in building a team is people who bring outside perspective, people who aren't, necessarily of the culture that we knew in the past in these newsrooms. People who, by virtue of their life experience, are going to enrich our journalism, enrich our debates about what positions we should take on issues, and who, by virtue of having been a lot of places or seen a lot of things from their perspective, will actually, I think, make either natural, gifted writers or natural leaders like Amber.
Thank you so much, Bina. I really love the idea of kind of transferable skill sets, the way in which you can apply a skill set and also then expand and grow within a role as you move kind of through a particular career trajectory. So that's really helpful, I think, for our audience to think about. Also, the idea of the culture of the newsroom, that's something we may come back to. Where obviously we're thinking about BIPOC, but there are all of the intersections of gender and sexuality and what it means to be a particular body in a particular space. So certainly to think about cultures, workplace cultures, and how those have changed or are changing. And then finally, I think the idea of this concept of a superpower and really kind of owning your own skill set and how you can also share that with others in terms of being a role model or a mentor. And it may be helpful for us to come back to the idea of mentorship. Amber, would you like to step into the conversation?
Sure. I can really relate to a lot of what Bina was sharing about spending time in different fields and taking a risk to jump to another one. And then looking back on that and saying, I would not be here if I hadn't taken that leap of faith. And this leap of faith, I actually started out as a broadcast producer, as a researcher, bottom of the totem pole for NBC Nightly News, doing all of the jobs and the grunt work and working my way to be a producer. That's where I learned that I loved to tell stories, important stories that, changed hearts or changed minds or changed laws. And I wanted to be able to do all of it, every different kind of story. And that's what you needed to do as a general producer. And there was a moment in the newsroom, though, where my, Newt says he was the cool Black guy in the room. I was sometimes the only Black girl in the room or Black person in the room of our newsroom meetings. And I remember one morning my EP called on me because I think there was a Black story, if you will, that she was wondering what everybody thought about. And she just cold called me, Amber, what do you think? And I was taken aback. I found something to bring to the table there in that moment. But first I was offended, she's just calling on me because I'm the Black person in the room. And then I realized, you know what, I need to have an opinion on any story that is about, my community. I need to be the one pitching it or the one defending it or the one steering us away from that. And there's nothing wrong with that. I took ownership at that moment and really shifted my perspective and started to raise my hand and to pitch those stories and tell those stories, realizing that if I didn't do that, I don't know who will. And, I want to be able to represent these stories properly. And so it was really that moment that I thought, okay, I'm not marginalizing myself by being the one and maybe being the go-to person for this kind of a story. And that was kind of made further, drilled in further to me, after 10 years as a producer, I was given the chance to launch NBC Black, NBC BLK, which is a vertical of NBCnews.com dedicated to telling Black stories. And I had mentors who said, are you sure you want to do that? You're going to maybe pigeonhole yourself, and you're going to kind of position yourself to just be, doing the Black stories. And I still thought, that's what I want to do. Those are the stories I want to tell, because there's a void here. I'm not seeing those stories. I can't get that story into a 22-minute broadcast, but I could get it into digital, and I could get this distribution there further. So it was a risk that some people, were telling me to be a little bit wary of. But those moments just have really pushed me and secured my interest in telling these stories that don't get told, and thinking about platforms and ways to tell them. And so if you're ever feeling like this might pigeonhole me, I don't know if I want to be thought of as that person who always pitches the, fill in the blank stories. You can learn a lot from that. You can take ownership of that. That can be a beat for you. A lot of the people that I've, there have been stories I thought of, they were a thread in my mind at that time that then I was able to do years later, which is very fulfilling. So those are just some things that I learned along the way about, following your interests and not being ashamed of telling those kinds of stories, because now we're in this moment where people are looking around for BIPOC storytellers.
Absolutely. Thank you, Amber. It does seem to be a question of balance, of being able to stand in positions where you have full range and full scope of any kind of storytelling, that you have the skill set and the positionality to tell those stories, but also the importance always of representation and ownership, and really being able to lift up voices that may not otherwise be heard. I'm mindful of the fact we've also touched on the idea of risk taking in an industry that is rapidly changing in terms of print culture, the way in which younger audiences connect to media. And I think, Amber, you really point to the fact that as newspapers may be closing or shifting in terms of circulation, there are also these other amazing opportunities to push stories out into the world. And there's that aspect of creativity and innovation that you're also drawing upon. So we'll turn to Vanessa, back to this question of a seat at the table.
Yes, it's so inspiring to hear people's stories. I think I see my own career path, pieces of my own career path in each of the stories that have been shared. I would say that for myself, I work in books, and books have, to a large extent, not completely, but to a large extent have remained not just overwhelmingly white, but as an industry, in spite of the number of innovations, right? The ebook, the audiobook, the dominance of Amazon as a retailer, the book publishing industry has sort of stayed the same. I've been a book editor and publisher for 20 years. And frankly, I'll be honest, my rise to the place where I'm grateful to be right now has been very slow. When I initially joined book publishing, I was in my late 20s. A little bit, as Bina had said, I came to it from, I had been in the academy, I had worked at The Nation magazine, I had a background, I had an interest in politics, I had, a very amateur background in those things, or a very beginner entry level. But I knew I was a passionate reader. I'm the child of autodidacts, people who didn't go to college but loved books and considered them to possess the utmost cultural capital. And so it was something I wanted to do, and I was willing to, start at the bottom, as one does. And what I found in the early part of my career is that I begun to build a niche for myself. I was good at serious nonfiction. I had, in less than 10 years, I had 3 books win the Pulitzer Prize. And that was an identity, I think, that I loved and was very proud of. But what I found for myself is that whatever the industry had in mind when they saw an editor of thought-provoking, serious, historical nonfiction was not who I am. And it required a shift for me to continue to enjoy a career in this industry. I had to, I would say, almost like find another gear. I had to think about how I could position myself as an experienced editor who could partner with authors who had more commercial ambitions. because I saw that that was a potential playing field that would be more open to me. Although to be honest, like it did require like a kind of recasting of who I was and what I wanted to do, because I am a nerd and I would be happy to read the New York Review of Books and just, and talk about the fine points of English colonial wind down. But that was not the way it was going to be. And I think I have found, and I say this not just to put a positive spin on it, but truly that the beauty of publishing books with an aim for the bestseller list and to attract a wide readership is that it brings in self-educated people and autodidacts and people who care about the culture and what is new and what is sexy and what is interesting and new voices and moving our world forward. And that is extremely appealing to me. It's always been appealing on a personal level, political level, but it's appealing to me on an artistic level. And I get to do that now. So I think persisting is in my own career is a theme.
Thank you, Vanessa. Yes, the issue and question of tenacity and perseverance, resilience, a willingness to kind of stick with a particular desire or passion, I think is obviously critical to any person in the creative industries, especially as they navigate all of the challenges of particular cultural spaces. Just to come back to that issue of culture. You touched, Vanessa, on the changing face of publishing, kind of the specter of Amazon, but also thinking about other platforms, e-readers, audiobooks, things like that. And I do wonder how, given the shift following the spring of last year and everything we lived through in terms of that kind of political moment, as well as the election of 2020 and understanding the particular moment at the beginning of this year, as well as living through a global pandemic, all of these forces coming to bear around issues of race and representation. I do wonder if we might think a little bit now about the concept of accountability, policy changes, what kinds of progress you are seeing or not seeing. So just to come back to this idea that companies have made these very public commitments or statements of allegiance, affinity to the work of anti-racism, and we want to underscore the work. It's an ongoing process, never finished. And so the question is, to what degree have they been held accountable? Have they held themselves accountable? Are you seeing progress? Are you seeing changes? Bina, we might turn to you first. Thank you. Sure.
So the summary answer is yes, but we need to be vigilant. But so let me elaborate and just say that I do think there has been, in part because of the murder of George Floyd, but also in part because of generational change in newsrooms, as well as I think really the culture and values of being a journalist, which is about, really telling the stories of our communities, bringing our readers the truth, no matter how uncomfortable that truth is. A lot of the tension and scrutiny has come from within newsrooms, not just people outside of them agitating for change, though that broader climate of agitating for change, I think, has inspired and reinforced what's happening within the newsrooms to hold leadership accountable for not just diversity, inclusion, and equity in terms of as a workplace, but making investments in covering communities that have been neglected and telling stories that need to be told, in recalibrating how they think about concepts like objectivity. So, having come from the world of teaching undergrads at MIT who are going to be scientists, how to think about how to explain what science is to the public, to the world of journalism, and where the ideas of objectivity kind of correspond in each of these realms. And I think there's this notion that there are such things as objective people, which has been a coded way of I think, reinforcing a bias of sort of middle American whiteness, maleness, long-standing notions of what it is to be objective are, of course, flavored by what people think is neutral, or what people think is balanced, or what people think is fair, which is affected by all the biases that affect almost everything that we thought of, from our history to our culture. And similarly, I try to bring some of the lessons, again, as an outsider, of what scientists do. So you don't expect a scientist who is a certain color of skin or certain gender or identity to be any less of a scientist when it comes to doing that experiment in the lab and measuring, the toxins in the soil. You don't say to that person, you can't be objective because you look like this, or you might have this microbe in your body, so you can't study this virus. We don't say that, because we say there's a method, a scientific method that we apply to the process of science that allows it to be as objective as it can be. We all know that people's subjective biases and experiences shape what questions they ask as scientists and all that. And I think that's the similar way to how we're starting to at least have the conversation and think about journalism, which is to say, it's not about how you look or how you identify in terms of whether you're able to apply a rigorous process. I even want to get away from saying objective to really weighing the facts and telling the truth. And sometimes the truth means you devalue certain perspectives that are on the fringe. And a great example of this is covering climate change. You don't give a lot of weight to the people who say climate change isn't happening and isn't real, because that's not grounded in fact. It's not grounded in truth. And so those sort of deeper questions about what it is to cover our communities, what it is to cover the truth of racial injustice, and not feel like we have to represent points of view just because they exist in our society. Certainly we have to address really good counter arguments, particularly in opinion journalism. But so that shift is happening. But I always worry with things like this that they're trends, that they're fads, and that the investment won't be sustained over time. And I think it's up to all of us. I mean, part of what we have to do is like just build it into the structure, right? It's like it's about hiring, but it's also like how we think. It's how we do things. It's really like changing the values and the approach and the goals of how we accomplish things that I really take on as my my responsibility as a leader.
Thank you, Bina. Others who see particular connections to their own particular spaces within publishing and media in terms of progress, seen or not seen, infrastructural changes, structural changes to be made?
I'm happy to jump in just to chime in with Bina. I think, I definitely noticed that after the uprisings and, there was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction across newsrooms where newsrooms were really funding and hiring more persons of color. This causes me concern in some ways, just because I also want to see this as a long-lasting change. I want to see this as real impact. But so I think it's something to be seen and looked at. A lot of the, TV networks have started kind of race and equity type of editorship positions, people who can kind of be that ombudsman to take a look at what their shows are doing and what is missing. So I'm very interested to see, how that works and how well that works. I think COVID also brought us stories about inequality and brought health equity really to the forefront. So I think those are also places that I'm seeing and I hope to see more of in terms of coverage and really going deeper than the stories that have been done in the last year. And I think, there's also an element of newspapers looking at how they're covering the community. We're serving the community here, but what are we really doing to a community? What kind of impact are we having? And, from the AP just announcing last week that they're no longer naming suspects in minor crimes. And that's really huge, because those are the stories. They're odd, they're interesting, they're salacious, and they're those short stories. What if that person, was acquitted? What if the charges were dropped or reduced? as they often are, that person's name is in print, in ink, is on digital, and they can be lifelong impact. It's something that the Boston Globe is actually, taking a look at with a program they have called Fresh Start Initiative, where they're actually allowing people to go back and say, hey, my case was dropped. I really think that the Globe needs to change the arc, update the coverage, or, and let the record, be updated, not to rewrite history, but to let that be updated and not to be something that holds people back. So I'm very interested in following those kinds of, adjustments in coverage. And I think there are a lot of other, newspapers and digital organizations that are taking a look at things like that. And I think that is definitely a start.
I'll speak for the book publishing industry. I think book publishers, thank you, Amber, want very much book publishers to feed the interests that seem ascendant in the broader culture. And I think since the murder of George Floyd, there has been, it's impossible to escape the amount of media attention and focus there has been on race in America. And so for that reason, I am hopeful that book publishers across the board will understand, we'll see BIPOC excellence, will recognize the need to expand the idea of what stories reflect who we are, who the we is, and what those stories are. I will say, on the other hand, though, that the book publishing industry has really remarkable people in it, like Chris Jackson, who's the publisher and the chief editor at One World, who do such fantastic work and have been doing it and have been leading the way for so many years, and so there is a first mover advantage in terms of building the kind of list that he has built, that has so many remarkable writers on it. And he has done so much to build up the market, quite literally, for those books, right? Bookstores, communities that support books, bookstagrammers, just the way that he has built this market is something that other publishers will benefit from. And so I think as a publisher, as a competitor of Chris's, I think that the question is, how do we define what our excellence is? What can we add to the conversation? What can we do? And I think some of that, frankly, and a way in which the Hachette Book Group, where I work, where Little Brown is, has led the way, is in educating the people who I work with about these, giving them the knowledge and the information to truly understand why having a list that does not reflect the United States is a problem, and that it's a problem that only compounds the longer the failure to really stand up and recognize who readers are, what the market is. The longer that happens, the sort of more ground that we lose. It's becoming almost an issue, in my opinion, of market survival. And I tend to think of it that way. I might be a bit dire in those predictions, because of course, my own sense is that, to stay culturally relevant is really the only way to be a successful book publisher. But it's definitely a subject that there's a lot of attention and care being put to. And I think with that care are a lot of hopes and dreams of the BIPOC employees who work at these companies, that we might actually work at a place where not just that our contributions are recognized, but that our contributions are seen as essential, important to the company.
Yeah.
Thank you, Vanessa. We'll turn to New.
Yeah, thank you, Vanessa. From my perspective, being an indie publication, especially with the murder of George Floyd, we had this it was like a race. Every single brand or any entity was like, oh, this is a Black design publication, let's go talk to them. And one of the things that me and my two co-founders, who are also Black, have discussed, and even from the inception of DEEM, is that we didn't set out to create a Black design journal. We set out to create a design journal. We're Black. Innately, the content in it is going to lean Black, but we do not set out to purely represent that vision. And what we try to do is taking more theoretical or academic or very future facing design concepts and actually grounding it in community, grounding it in people, and actually grounding it in people who don't naturally sit in the space of design or who don't get the opportunity to speak about their work in the framework of design. And so with that, a part of what we've been doing is there is this education process with partners. There is this education process with readers to actually start to see that the way how we even engage has to be from a much more systemic and long-term solution approach. And even in my past careers in marketing, I already know that there is your general budget, and then there's a budget that goes towards other initiatives, right? That could be gender related, race related. And now what's happening is that, oh, they're just like, well, we're gonna add more money to the other bucket, but we still have our general bucket, and that general bucket is still 10 times bigger than the other bucket. And now just because the other bucket has grown, like let's give ourselves a pat on the back. And really what the conversation is that actually that general budget should include everyone, and everything should be in one pot. And we still shouldn't be centering white, heteronormacy, cisgendered, able-bodied people as the people who we're trying to engage with. And so part of what we're dealing with, okay, well, how do we navigate and educate and make sure that we're still holding our community at the center and still centering the voices that we want to engage with, while still being able to, I guess, be patient as all these bigger institutions are coming around and trying to figure things out. There is a reaction from us initially to say no, but then we realized that, well, if there's help is needed, how can we add value? How can we help to be a steward during this time and help to also navigate the complexities that are all these oppressive systems? And we don't have the solution, we aren't the solution, but we do try to at least cast a wide enough net within various communities to try to move closer to something that feels more equitable.
Thanks, Nu. Again, I think you've each provided us with a sense of the kinds of learnings, but also resources and tools that various people within your spaces are bringing to doing the work of anti-racism and looking towards the vision and goal of equity across various spaces within the field. I do wonder in the time that we have before we move to the idea of knowledge passing, because I think that will be critical for our audience, just to think for a quick moment about the idea of building community and really thinking about BIPOC joy, because it's something that I don't want to lose from the conversation. I was really interested in, Vanessa, that you mentioned Chris Jackson and his work, and you framed him as a competitor within the industry, but someone who is doing exemplary work. And I wonder how you do think about community building, how you're able to reach out to people who may be in competitive spaces within the market to have that sense of connection and access. I wonder if Vanessa, you might pick up on that.
Yeah, I love that question. I mean, I think that book publishing can be a very lonely business. I mean, I say this, of course, the pandemic has made all of our jobs in some ways very insular, more self-directed. But there's something about the experience of reading books that is so intimate and hits you so hard. You know, I think that I tend to I have a practice where when I read something I really love, I reach the editor. It's not hard to find that person usually in the acknowledgement section of the book, or because I might have wanted to buy the book myself, but wasn't the bidder who won the auction. And I just try to forge or have forged over the years a connection with those peers of mine, because whether they're my age, often younger, since I'm no spring chicken, I love to just have that sense of what drives people to towards excellence, how they read and how they read people's book buying habits. There's this sort of strange, not strange, I should say peculiar and very specific fact of book publishing, especially nonfiction book publishing, which is you buy a book anywhere from 2, 3, or more years ahead of when it's published. So a lot of what book editors do, and really fine book editors like Nicole Counts and Chris Jackson at One World and Elizabeth Mendez-Berry, is they're reading things, they're trying to decide what people want to read so many years ahead. And I try to do that as well. And, it's a little bit, it's not a science. It's a bunch of guesses and hunches and ideas. And of course, also just recognizing, brilliance and talent when it's before you, and being willing as an editor to go with the instinct of the storyteller, the author, and what he or she wants to, or what they want to write. But I do think that there's a way that I begin as a reader sometimes to just think, really just get inside the imagination of certain people. A person comes to mind, Anna Stein, who's a literary agent, and she represents Hana Yanagihara and some other sort of literary heroes of mine. And it's always just so interesting for me to read her books. I kind of tend to read just like to see sort of whose ideas, whose voices, whose imagination she follows. And I think in that sense, it's not a corporeal community, it's virtual, or it's in the head. But I think that, it's sort of what makes, and I'll wrap this up because I'm going on and on, but I think of a One World book, Detransition Baby by Tori Peters, which really is a fantastic novel. And it's about a trans woman who detransitions and forms a family. And it's a book of a number of sort of really fascinating sort of reversals of identity, but also commonality and purpose. And it's about motherhood. It's like a next level book in so many ways, but that book was published by One World, which is not, so it's sort of like just thinking of the different layers to think about intersectionality and identity, and I guess I'm just a fan. I like being a fan of things that are really great, and also expressing that, because I think even if you admire something, there's something about the way you articulate it that can also sort of crystallize, I think for me, sort of what I think is great, and how I can find greatness in the books that I'm working on.
Thanks, Vanessa. I love the idea of fandom as well, and really finding those points of connection. Others who might want to talk to us a little bit about community building or finding joy in the work that you do?
Yeah, I can jump in.
Thanks.
Community is at the core of everything we do at Dean. And what we've learned and what reflects back to us is that we've been able to create a space that that actually reflects a lot of people that felt excluded from the world of design. And so even for context, the way how we frame up design is the process of adding value. One thing that we've learned is that when most people think of design, they think of outputs of design. They'll think of graphic design, industrial design, fashion design. All those things are output of a process of adding value, in which that process starts with being able to find common issues that you can solve. But because we think of design from a standpoint of outputs, what we're really doing is looking at design based off of fidelity. How beautiful and polished and grand is this output? But in that conversation, what usually is left out are resources, because the difference between your idea, what you ideated, and what you're able to actually produce is the resources. And so a lot of times, the only people who get the opportunities to be designers with a capital D are people who have the resources to produce beautiful, shiny, polished objects. And really what we do is look at design from the standpoint of process, in which in a process that leads to an output, there's so much that you can learn, you can reflect, you can dissect, you can adopt, you can adapt. And in the process, you don't need resources for a process. And what we've seen is that that actually allows us to have many more robust conversations with people who traditionally won't be able to have a design-based conversation. And so even our first cover featured Adrienne Marie Brown, writer, activist, doula, amazing human being. And when we initially reached out, she was like, well, I'm not a designer. And we're like, perfect. We were like, that's exactly what we want. And in our conversation with her, my partner, Alice, who's the editor-in-chief, was interviewing her. We flew to her house in Detroit. And there's a moment where she's like, oh, I guess the work I do is design. And we're like, exactly. It's just that the institutions and the systems that have been set up only propel one narrative and one focus on design. And so even in issue two features Lauren Halsey on the cover. And part of the things that we're really excited about is this idea of BIPOC joy, and is this idea of showing up as you are and not necessarily having to show up in the same way that you would expect a designer would show up. So even the cover features Lauren Halsey in her studio, sitting on a bucket, wearing salmon slippers and a Parliament Funkadelic Bootsy Collins shirt. And in that, like, that is what we want to be able to represent, because that is what represents Lauren's work. And Lauren, being an artist, but being trained as an architect, turned her artist studio into a food redistribution center during COVID in South Central. And those are the stories that we want to be able to tell. And what we found is that there is a community of people who are like, oh, I actually resonate with this. I didn't know how to really articulate the type of work I want to do, or I'm in a place where I'm doing this type of work, but I really want to be doing this. And Deem kind of helps me to be able to think about that and articulate that and find commonality in that. And so for us, we're purely driven by our community. And that's why I keep saying we always try to go back and really understand and listen to what just doesn't resonate with us, but what starts to resonate with the commonality of people who haven't felt like they had a voice in the space of design, architecture, social impact, and may not show up as polished and have all the accolades as somebody else. For us, we're always looking and saying that your vision, your process, the way how you contextualize things is valuable, and it may not have to be on a TED Talk stage in order for it to have value or be able to produce impact.
Great, thank you, Nu. I love the idea of rearticulation and also meeting people where they are to really expand the boundaries of the creative work that we do. We have 5 or so minutes, and so I'd love to turn to the idea of passing the baton of the knowledge that you have, and to think about advice that you would give to aspiring BIPOC directors in terms of lessons learned within your field or from other examples. It would also be really helpful if you have resources that you might be able to share, whether that's websites or particular communities, publications, other kinds of recommendations, something that I think our audience would appreciate. So I'll turn to Bina, if you'd like to talk about advice that you would give to aspiring journalists or policymakers.
Sure. And I'll just say I was inspired by listening to Vanessa to share, because I'm an author. Also, I've written only one book. It's called The Optimist Telescope, Thinking Ahead in a Reckless Age. But when I was navigating that process as a writer, the publishing process, it really required, it's one of the most solitary things I've ever done. But at the same time, it really required cultivating a community of fellow travelers and particularly people who'd done it before. So I would just say, as a writer, if you're a journalist writer, finding authors who've gone through the process and can help you kind of navigate, shopping or dating literary agents and, the kind of Byzantine, I'm sorry, Vanessa, ways of the publishing industry and what might happen and what to freak out about and what to stay calm about. I think that that's just really important to have fellow travelers. And I would say in general, that's kind of a theme for me. I like to have, kind of an informal group of people that I consult on things. They're not as a group, but, people I call, sometimes they're people younger than me and more up and coming. Sometimes they're people who are like the sages who've been around a long time in journalism. And being able to just call them up and say, here's the situation I'm facing, what would you do? Or how would you think about this? Has been hugely helpful to me. And so I think that's just, I don't think you can force that kind of thing. I think mentoring up and down happens when people naturally get along the way that friends naturally get along, but making sure that you're tuning in to both what you have to offer as perspective, which you, even early in your career, you have something to offer as perspective, particularly with some of these generational shifts we've been talking about in the industry. But also not being afraid to ask for advice and help. People love giving advice. If you email someone with a very specific question about something they know about that they can advise you on, you're more likely to get a response, and an enthusiastic response, than if you're just like, can we set up a 15-minute chat, or, something generic. Like, people just love to help. So, hone that skill at like articulating what you need and what you need advice on, and being able to ask the questions in a targeted way. Other advice, I really do feel, Louise, what you were saying about persistence is so important, that there are going to be barriers. There are going to be people who look at you and say like, no, I've never seen anyone like you in this role, just by virtue of where we are in our society. But it's more important for you not to lose your ability to imagine different things that you can do and want to be, and to follow your passion to do them. So don't, I guess more than anything, I'm not saying work yourself to the bone. I'm saying don't lose sight of your ability to imagine yourself doing what you want to do.
Thank you. Amber, would you like to share advice to our younger audience members, or older, to anyone listening?
Sure. I'm going to agree with Bina on having your own advisory board, people that that you can go back to. And these are going to be people you meet in your career, and you may not talk to them for years. You may connect with them years later, and that's okay. I recently did that when I was, considering coming to the Globe, and it just reminded me that I need to cultivate, these friendships and these connections, which can be difficult and takes time. But sometimes it's just finding that excuse to keep in touch, finding that excuse to say, I saw this article and I thought of you, or, oh, Vanessa, I really loved that book and I'm listening to the audiobook. Just wanted to let you know that. You never know what comes back on that reply. I've had people reply, hey, actually, I'm looking to hire someone for this job. And do you know anybody, or are you interested? It's checking in with people where you learn there may be an opportunity for you. That's how I got my first job. Just following up with a mentor. I'm going to be in New York. Can I stop by? Getting called back 10 minutes later, there's a job opening. So those things happen in the media industry every day. And then, along the way, create your own job, write your job description. I also had that happen when I was leaving NBC, and they said, why don't you just think about anything you'd want to do? Is there something you'd want to do here? And just write a job description. And to my great surprise, I came up with something crazy, and they entertained that conversation for me. So that's just something, it helps you also to kind of think about what you really want to do, from, the kind of a title to, what do you actually want to do and not do? And it could help you focus on your goals and what you want to do next.
Thanks, Amber. We just have a couple of minutes left, so we'll turn quickly to Nu and then Vanessa.
Well, mine is going to be a yes and, because Bina and Amber pretty much took what I was going to say. Shoot your shot. Don't be afraid to reach out, but when you reach out, make sure you come prepared as possible with what the ask is. Even if it's a vague ask, but just make sure you put some thought to it. And then also, if you are currently in a role and you're looking for what is the next step, you may feel like you're in a rut. Go and look up job descriptions. Job descriptions will give you exactly what you need to do in your current role. What are the things, what are the knowledge, the skills, experience that you can start to work on now, whether it's in your current role or outside of your current role, that will help you to be hireable for the next role that you desire. And so when I was younger, I spent a lot of times copy and pasting and storing job descriptions for roles that I was not even qualified for at that moment, but knew that, oh, when I become the director of this, here's what they're looking for. What can I start to do now that will set me up for that?
Terrific. Thank you, Vanessa.
Yeah, all of this has been such good advice. I love the idea of compiling job descriptions. I must say, in years past, I've compiled the messages that people have written as they're leaving their jobs and use that as sort of like my internal spur to, avoid, to just stay put and be patient. To all of that excellent advice, I think I would just add to really listen to the people that you're working for, the context that you're currently in, and then to listen to yourself. This sort of echoes something Dina said, to really figure out the career you envision for yourself, the contribution you envision you can make to the career that you have chosen, and to find ways to articulate that. If you're going to be an editor, think about honing your writing skills or your book retail skills. Think about, all of the like micro parts of a job that actually have more components and interact more with other people, and take heart from the communities that are out there that love what you love and see the world the way you do and can make common cause with you, which is just echoing what others said.
Wonderful, thank you. I wanted, just in closing, was there a website or a database or anything that you might recommend as a kind of catch-all place that people might go to for job descriptions or other advice?
I mean, I found that Instagram has posted a lot of great jobs. And the reason why is because I hire people now. So now I also say job description because I was like, oh, that's how you phrase that specific thing. So I follow a lot of accounts that post great job opportunities. It's going to take me too long to find it right now. But also just the usual Simply Hired, and just being able to type in strategy director, creative director, and just going through and seeing just what those jobs entail.
Thank you. We're up on time. This was just a wonderful conversation. Amber, Bina, Nu, Vanessa, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. It was just really great to be in conversation with you today. So thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Do we stay on? Okay. Oh. Goodbye. I wasn't sure if we're supposed to stay on or not. So I guess I'm just gonna
I'm not sure if Jason will jump back in. Oh, we can hop off.
Yeah, you can hop off. Thank you so much. Adios.